Our next speaker is Dr. George Rable from the University of Alabama. And before we proceed with his talk, I want to tell you that he is certainly well qualified to speak on civil disturbances and civil disorders and conflict resolution. He is from Ohio and is an Ohio State fan. He received his PhD from LSU, and he has some football appreciation for LSU. He sent his children to Auburn, and he teaches at the University of Alabama, so he is an expert in conflict resolution. And so we'll expect to hear some fascinating compromises and methodology for bringing peace, certainly to, and of course, you know, he buys into the South, because one of his forthcoming books is called Damn Yankees. Well, it's a little bit more sophisticated title than that, but that's how it starts, and it got my attention. So, Dr. Rable is the George G. Somerset Chair of Southern History at the University of Alabama. That's a living paradox from Ohio, you know, and you're Southern History, never mind. He received his bachelor's degree from Bluffington College and his master's and doctoral degrees from LSU. Dr. Rable, like our other speakers earlier, is the recipient of multiple scholarly awards and is well known as a Civil War historian. His God's Almost Chosen Peoples, a religious history of the American Civil War, was the museum's selection to place in your packet of material. I think he will be available later on to sign those copies if you would like that. The title of his presentation today is God as General. Was there a religious history of the American Civil War? Dr. Rable plans to examine how Americans used religious faith to interpret the causes, course, and consequences of the war. Soldiers and civilians, ministers and politicians often discuss everything from Union to emancipation, in particular battles in religious terms. Themes of sin, providence, judgment, all of these are essential to understanding how Americans viewed the greatest crisis in American history. So, if you will, please welcome with me Dr. George Rable. An expert in conflict resolution.
It's hard to know what to say after that gracious but humorous introduction. I thank you all for the hospitality and for the invitation to be here. I've had a delightful time so far. I'm always wary of speaking after lunch. That's a dangerous slot to be in. It's not quite as bad as a number of years ago when I first started working on the Battle of Fredericksburg. I did an after-dinner talk on the carnage at Fredericksburg that heavily dealt with amputations in great detail. So this maybe is not quite that tough an assignment. The talk is couched in terms of a question: was there a religious history of the American Civil War? And I guess the answer to that question had better be yes, or I'll just sit down. And since I've written a whole book on this subject, I guess the answer is yes. Though I think it's a history that in some ways has been largely forgotten, not only by the general public, but I think by Civil War buffs in particular. Certainly, as we heard this morning, as Abraham Lincoln stated in his second inaugural address, both sides prayed to the same God and read the same Bible. And I think religious language, religious imagery, and ideas are absolutely pervasive during the Civil War era. Now, let me start off with a statistic that's even more questionable than any of the statistics we dealt with this morning. in fact, by a long shot, but I think it's an interesting one. There was an attempt in the year 1855 to figure out just how religious were the American people. There were about 27 million Americans in 1855, and this study concluded that out of this population of 27 million, approximately 4 million were members of some Protestant church. And you might throw in 1 million, 1.5 million Roman Catholics. Now, to most people, this number is a surprise. We would think the numbers would be far higher. We certainly have an image of our 19th century ancestors as being quite religious. In fact, probably more religious than we are. At the same time, I think that number 4 million expressed something that we heard about something in last night's talk, the evangelical movements, the First and Second Great Awakening. Those numbers in proportion would have probably been much lower in 1800 or in 1750, but why only 4 million? Well, I think there's one thing we forget about all of this. Standards of church membership have changed over the decades and centuries. When my wife and I joined Forest Lake United Methodist Church in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, we briefly were brought up to the front of the church, mumbled answers to a couple questions, and were handed the offering envelopes. I mean, that doesn't set the bar very high. And I think that's typical, at least of mainline Protestant churches. Well, in the 19th century, the standards of church membership were somewhat higher. You might have to be willing to have your behavior carefully scrutinized by other church members. Methodists and Baptists were especially good at this. Many people didn't consider themselves worthy to become members of churches. A number of people in churches didn't think they were worthy either. So the bar was set considerably higher. Therefore, I think this 4 million number undoubtedly underestimates the pervasiveness of religious ways of thinking in 19th century America, and these religious ways of thinking in the Civil War generation, which is obviously the focus of this talk today. Now, if there's one word I would like you to take away from this talk, that word is providence. I think the idea of divine providence is a central belief, not only a central religious belief, but it's a belief that's used to really explain the causes and course and consequences of the American Civil War. The ordinary events of life are interpreted in providential terms, but in addition to that, there's a strong belief that the story of America is part of a larger story of human history, a kind of unfolding of providential design, if you will. Now, we mere mortals perhaps could at times catch a glimpse of this larger meaning in human history, but both in its long sweep and messy details, history remains very much in God's hands. I think that's the central belief, and I think to some degree that's reflected in some of Lincoln's statements as well. This kind of God talk was absolutely commonplace. It was part of the language of ordinary life. It's just there all the time. If you read the sources from the Civil War era, you don't have to look very far to find belief in divine providence at various levels. So it's hardly surprising that many Americans would use their religious beliefs, and especially ideas about providence, to interpret and understand the sectional crisis of the 1850s and also the Civil War itself. Though today I think much of this experience has been forgotten. And I will cite a fairly recent example. In the aftermath of 9/11, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and President Obama's former minister Jeremiah Wright all explained 9/11 as a punishment for American sins. Now, the three of them disagreed on the sins for which the nation was being punished. And I do take a certain perverse delight in putting Falwell, Robertson, and Wright together. And I figure I'm probably one of the few people who've ever done that. But what is interesting about those examples is not what they had to say. What was interesting to me as a historian was the reaction to what they said. And it wasn't just, the sort of outrage that was expressed about the connection between particular sins and 9/11. It was the idea that this was somehow a new way of viewing important events in our history. It seems to me what Falwell, Robertson, and Wright did was part of a tradition, not only in American religious history, but really in world religious history. It's certainly the way the Civil War generation would have interpreted 9/11. It's the way the Civil War generation would probably have interpreted the tornado that struck Tuscaloosa, Alabama, my hometown, my adopted hometown, several years ago. That this must reflect some kind of providential design. It must be some kind of punishment for sin. But Civil War historians have largely failed to incorporate this religious perspective into larger narratives of the war. If you read the works of Bruce Catton, Shelby Foote, James McPherson, particularly though McPherson dealt with religion later on in talking about soldiers in his Battle Cry of Freedom book, there's hardly any mention of religion at all. This would have struck the Civil War generation as very odd, if not perverse. Certainly the sectional tensions of the 1850s, the secession crisis in the winter of 1860-61 were seen as providential, as a kind of punishment for individual and collective sin. And virtually all groups embraced this providential view of current events. Less than a month after the firing on Fort Sumter, for example, a leading Quaker weekly observed that national sins, unless repented of, are always punished by national calamities. And the Quakers are far from being Calvinists, but they're speaking in terms that would have been very familiar to Calvinists and more broadly to Americans. Even Unitarians talked about the nation approaching Pentecostal days. I don't know about you, but I don't usually associate Unitarians with discussions of the Pentecost. In any event, the war was seen as divine judgment on the nation. But if that's so, how should that divine judgment be interpreted? Does God have a purpose in this conflict? If so, what is it? And even with greater difficulty, how can we human beings discern God's purpose in the conflict? The Civil War generation had answers to these difficult questions. First of all, they saw secession and war as punishment for sin, and their definition of sin was wide-ranging. I always like to talk about sin because as human beings, we are all experts on it. We are all participants in it. None of us have avoided the problem of sin, though we are certainly better at identifying other people's sins than our own. And certainly the Civil War generation in that sense was probably much like us. But in any event, they are wide-ranging definitions. Collective and individual sins. Had the war been brought on by slavery? Or was it political corruption? Or was it partisanship? Or was it materialism? All of these things might have caused the war. But individual sins as well. Sabbath breaking, profanity, drunkenness, gambling. The list could go on and on. And these broad definitions and long lists of sins crossed ideological and sectional lines. In other words, there was not necessarily a conservative emphasis on individual sin or a reformist emphasis on collective sin. It sort of got all mixed together. For example, a lot of the abolitionists were just as concerned about alcohol as they were about slavery. Slavery, a collective sin, alcohol abuse, an individual sin. Many of the abolitionists thought they were equally troublesome. And certainly many preachers and lay people, North and South, compiled similar lists of transgressions at the beginning of the war and indeed throughout the war. Now there are some distinctive Confederate themes. For example, Confederates argued that they had a tremendous advantage at the beginning of the war because the U.S. Constitution was a godless document. What did they mean by that? Unlike the Confederate Constitution, the United States Constitution did not invoke the favor of Almighty God. In fact, the only mention of God in the U.S., in the original U.S. Constitution, is in the year of our Lord 1787. Now, there is a prohibition against religious tests for office, but basically that's it. They're really not invoking the favor of God. The Confederate Constitution specifically invokes the favor of God. In fact, there was a wartime movement in the North to add some acknowledgement of God or even of Jesus Christ in the federal Constitution. This was pushed heavily by the Presbyterians. It didn't really get anywhere. Lincoln was very non-committal about this particular item. And some Confederates really wanted to strengthen their Constitution with an acknowledgement of Jesus Christ, but that didn't go anywhere either, though the Southern Presbyterians and Southern Baptists, there was a little flurry of debate between the two on that. Certainly Confederates believed not only was God on their side, but they suspected that the entire nation was being punished for what they called political preaching. And when Confederates talked about political preaching, they meant preaching against the institution of slavery. At the same time, virtually all Southern clergy defended slavery to one degree or another, though certainly some acknowledged that slaveholders had fallen short of biblical standards in dealing with their slaves. However that might be, religious voices, whether Union or Confederate, seldom expressed much doubt that God was on their side. And although some pious young men and their families sometimes asked if a believer could be a soldier, most churches and clergy answered that question with a resounding yes. And being a Methodist, I'm going to pick on the Methodists. I've got a talk that I gave at a Baptist seminary where I picked on the Baptists, but I'll give you the Methodist version here. The opening prayer of a New York Methodist conference came right to the point. We ask thee, we can pray here. We ask thee to bring these men, the rebels, to destruction and wipe them from the face of the country. That's the northern version. Writing to his brother, a Southern Methodist minister matched this kind of blood-curdling rhetoric, saying, "It is a righteous war. I feel a deep Christian and inextinguishable hatred toward the demons of the North who would desolate my country and destroy its liberties. It is doing God service to kill the diabolical wretches on the battlefield." Sectional loyalties often predominated in these church reactions to the war. A Southern Methodist, for example, deemed the Confederate States of America the last hope of freedom and the home of the pure gospel. There's almost a millennial sense here. Northern civil religion was just as fervent, and again I'll cite a Methodist example. "We will take our glorious flag," declared Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson, "and we will nail that flag just below the cross." If you know anything about Matthew Simpson, who was a very prominent Northern religious leader of his day, you might suspect that he would nail that flag slightly above the cross. Now, for sure, Quakers and Mennonites and other peace churches often maintained or tried to maintain their witness against war, but they often did so rather circumspectly. Quakers sought exemption from conscription. They received a fairly sympathetic hearing from the Lincoln administration, though the cynic in me wonders if Lincoln would have been so sympathetic had the Methodists, a much larger group, suddenly decided to become a peace church. However that might be, Quaker editors did not advise tax resistance, which would have led to a direct confrontation with the government. And several, in fact, acknowledged that many of their young people had become so caught up in the war excitement that they had simply enlisted. And there's some studies that indicate a large number of Quaker young men simply enlisted, ignoring the teachings of their church. So if the churches on both sides in general support the war, religion is also used to explain the course of the war itself. Notions of providence, the idea of war as punishment for sin, apocalyptic warnings of judgment, I think all become powerful and I would emphasize flexible ideas with which to interpret wartime events. Religion provides comfort to the anxious and the grieving for sure, but it also offers an explanation for suffering and for anguish, for victory and defeat. Battles and their results become signs of divine intent. And we might as well start with the first major battle of the American Civil War, First Bull Run or First Manassas, depending on which title you prefer to use. At this engagement, a bungled Federal flank attack and fierce Confederate counterattack just north of Manassas Junction, Virginia, drove the Yankees skedaddling back toward Washington. That's First Bull Run in one sentence. I hope Earl Hess is impressed with my ability to condense a battle into one sentence. Normally at this point, as a Civil War historian, I'd start moving regiments around and going into detail, but what I want to focus on is the religious meaning and consequence of the battle of First Bull Run or First Manassas. A Virginia woman living in the Shenandoah Valley, on hearing early reports of the fighting, prayed that Providence would guide the Confederates to victory. And for the victorious Confederates, it seemed that's exactly what had happened. The outcome of the battle itself became a sure sign of divine favor. And this manner of explanation would be used throughout the war. When you win, God is on your side. Need we further proof of God's providence, that our cause is just, that the South shall triumph? One enthusiastic Methodist asked. But what about all the brave and pious young men who fell in this battle and later even bloodier engagements? There had been an assumption at the beginning of the war that the Lord would safeguard the righteous in battle. But it soon became clear, of course, that many devout young men fell on every battlefield, as well as the not-so-devout. Indeed, printed sermons eulogized Christian soldiers who faced death fearlessly and that looked forward to reunion with their loved ones in heaven. In fact, I don't think it's an accident that heaven, during the Civil War era, was increasingly pictured as a homey place where families would come back together. I guess that's a good thing. I suppose it depends on the nature of your family. I can think of some relatives that I'm not sure I'd be all that keen on spending eternity with, but that's a different issue. But certainly the Civil War generation talked about a kind of heavenly reunion where your family would be restored. Letters were sent home by chaplains and officers, along with countless articles in the religious press, would report the last words of soldiers declaring their faith during their final moments on earth. And this was important. We talked about this morning how important are these numbers about death? What effect did this have on people at the time? One effect that death, no matter how we count the numbers, one large effect on people at the time was their whole idea about where people die had to change. People didn't die in the 19th century in hospitals and nursing homes. They died at home. And now you have a lot of people who aren't dying at home. They're dying in a hospital. They're dying on a battlefield. They may be thrown into a grave unmarked. You may not even know for sure that they had died. And I think this was very difficult for the people at the time to deal with. And so these letters sent home, supposedly reporting the soldiers' final words, become very, very important. Nor did the deaths of these fine young men, whether from wounds or more often from disease, seem to shake people's faith in God's sovereignty. In fact, as the Reverend Edward Reed told his rural South Carolina congregation shortly after the Confederate victory at Manassas, not one of these brave men has fallen or suffered without God's permission. In other words, God willed every death and every wound. This was hardly a surprising statement, it seems to me, during an era in which people believed that every death and every illness somehow conformed to God's will. Some people believed that the Lord had chosen the field of combat, supplied courage to the soldiers, and had even controlled the timing of troop movements and tactical maneuvers. By the same token, God had confounded the mighty Yankee army just as he had scattered the Assyrians, the Midianites, or the Philistines in Old Testament times. And in one reference that surely resonated with nearly everybody, an Alabama minister explained at some length how the southern David, and I bet you can fill in the blank, had slain the northern Goliath at the Battle of First Manassas. So this first great battle of the war had seemingly vindicated the Confederate cause and even sent some commentators leafing through their Bibles to search for references to the southern nation in prophecy. In fact, there was a long and rather turgid tome published during the Civil War with that exact title, The Southern Nation in Prophecy. If you ever suffer from insomnia, I think that is your cure. Read a few pages of that, you'll go right to sleep. The smallest incidents become signs of divine favor. We have the first accounts of Bibles stopping bullets. Testaments carried in the soldiers' pockets, stopping bullets, and these accounts always report the exact verse at which the point of the projectile stopped. And it's always a very significant verse. The one somewhat irreverent Confederate pointed out that it was a deck of cards, not a Bible, that had saved his life. He reported that to his mother. I think he kind of wanted to twit his mother a little bit. But in any event, it seemed after Manassas that all the southern people have to do is give God the glory, keep their trust in him. They're going to win the war, and the war will soon be over. Not surprisingly, northern believers have to take a much different tack after Bull Run. The judgments of God are upon us, declared one Presbyterian editor. The nation's leading Methodist newspaper, the Christian Advocate and Journal in New York, agreed that defeat had been doubtless ordered by Providence as part of a severe but wholesome discipline, which in the end will cure some desperate evils that have existed among us. In other words, it will be good for us. God had long shaped the nation's history and would continue to do so. Now, as was typical after almost every major battlefield loss on either side, the defeated side has to attempt to figure out which sins had stirred up God's wrath. And Northerners do this in the aftermath of Bull Run. Was it the sin of slavery? Was it political corruption? Was it materialism? Again, broad social sins. Or was it something else? When was Bull Run fought? Anyone know? What day of the week? Sunday. Sunday. This struck some commentators as highly significant. To launch an attack on the Sabbath day must surely have displeased the Lord. A kind of footnote here, Stonewall Jackson, a Presbyterians thought it was okay to fight on the Sabbath as long as you didn't attack on the Sabbath. It's kind of a fine distinction there. In any event, that seems significant. And the failure to observe the Sabbath in camp, along with the foolhardiness of launching an attack on Sunday, had surely displeased God. Others blamed the fact that soldiers swore and consumed alcohol. Kind of universal soldier vices. Horace Bushnell, a prominent Congregationalist minister whose name has been largely forgotten today but was very prominent in his own day, delivered a remarkable sermon right after First Bull Run called Reverses Needed, in which he worried about the defeat at Bull Run, and he saw it as a warning to a nation that had created a government, in his view, without moral or religious ideas. Bushnell termed Jefferson's Declaration of Independence nothing but godless theorizing. He said, no wonder the American Union must face reverses and losses, such as Bull Run, because without shedding of blood, there is no such grace prepared. Nor is it surprising that Bushnell will spend a lot of time after the Civil War writing on the doctrine of the atonement, looking at the shedding of blood as an act of atonement for sin. Now, Bushnell, like the clergy of his day, had no doubt that his side, the North, was fighting for just principles and had God on its side, but he also believed that more sacrifices would be needed to atone for national transgressions. The African American clergy warned that the nation had not yet faced up to the sins of slavery. And President Lincoln, right after Bull Run, had called for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. as both presidents, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, would do throughout the Civil War. Especially after defeats, you'd call for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. After victories, maybe a day of thanksgiving. So there are many of these public occasions during the war. Lincoln calls for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. The African American clergy, however, debate whether this day should even be observed. Henry McNeill Turner, who would later serve as one of the first Black Army chaplains, described the dead at Bull Run as the bloody victims of slavery's hellish caprice. Many abolitionists of both races now argued that God would allow the bloodshed to continue until African slavery was banished from the nation. In fact, throughout the war, denominations, churches, individuals, North and South, agonized and argued over the role of slavery in the war. Christians of various stripes had long debated whether God opposed, sustained, or was indifferent to slavery. And I think the war reshaped these discussions in both the North and the South, though I think we often forget how many 19th century Americans neither opposed nor supported slavery. They were rather indifferent to the subject. But that's a hard group to study, and so we haven't studied them, but I think we at least need to remember that fact. In the North, by the fall of 1862, even the more conservative denominations were coming to see the death of slavery as a matter of military, if not moral necessity. The belief that the northern side would not win so long as the nation clung to what one minister termed the Jonah of slavery. Even pacifist Quakers argued that God was using the war to punish the nation for the sin of slavery. And after Lincoln issued his final Emancipation Proclamation, ministers of both races invoked the Exodus story or even talked about the imminent return of Christ. The biggest exception were the Roman Catholics, who were skeptical about abolition, which they associated with infidelity. They considered abolition a dangerous, radical ideology. And they also believed that the principles that had helped keep the Catholic Church together could have prevented the war. In fact, Northern Catholic editors argued that the war represented the logical culmination of schismatic Protestant principles. In other words, if you hadn't had Protestants, you wouldn't have had a war. The Protestants are, by definition, divisive. Well, think about Baptists, for example. You get their point. So, you know, the Catholics, both North and South, take a little different tack on this. In the Confederacy, the Southern churches remain largely united behind the Southern nation and behind the institution of slavery. They refused to see the war as a punishment for slavery, but as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, defending slavery grew a bit more complicated. Church associations and ministers readily conceded that even though slavery was sanctioned by the scriptures, the behavior of many slaveholders fell short of biblical standards. Churches often decried the neglect of religious instruction, and some even condemned laws that discouraged teaching slaves to read. Reformers called for the legal recognition of slave marriages, and they called for laws prohibiting the breakup of families through sale. Now it's interesting, even though some ministers and churches supported this and pressed for them in political terms, they got nowhere. None of these proposals ever got out of committee in a state legislature, much less in the Confederate Congress. But the implicit promise of the reformers was, if they could reform slavery, not get rid of slavery, but reform slavery, this would win God's favor. And the politicians wanted none of it. And so the war continued. And you have mounting casualties. However high they might have mounted, we can debate the numbers endlessly, I suspect, and suffering on the home front. Seemingly, these casualties and all the suffering would challenge a providential view of war. But because human beings could at best achieve only an imperfect understanding of God's will, and because biblical history proved that the Lord had often used heathen nations to punish his stiff-necked chosen people, just refer to numerous instances in the Old Testament, even in 1864, believers north and south had hardly abandoned their civil religion. In both sections, they continued to believe that God was on their side, however inscrutable God's purposes might often appear. Now, of course, when I think of 1864, I think of horrific bloodletting at places like Kennesaw Mountain, or Wilderness, or Spotsylvania Courthouse, or Cold Harbor, or Petersburg. And this might readily lend war-weary soldiers and civilians to speak of pointless sacrifices, as many did. And it seemed logical enough, it seems to me at this point, for the clergy to say that the war had spun out of human control. Yet each victory, I think, rekindled hope of divine favor, and defeats could still be explained in terms of divine chastisement, the type of spiritual discipline for those whom God loved. And the usual lists of sins kept cropping up. Confederates in particular noted how their ministers were poorly paid, Sunday schools neglected, churches languished. Perhaps what many church associations termed a spiritual coldness perhaps helped account for their wartime suffering. In the fall of 1862, 2 years before, Georgia Methodist Bishop George F. Pierce sounded almost like Abraham Lincoln. And he could not chase away a deep sense of foreboding. He preached, "We are in the Lord's hands, and I know not what he means to do with us. In many respects, the prospects before us are dark. We have wrought wonders, but seem to have gained nothing. The war is without a parallel in the past as to its origins, its battle, its progress, and its results. I hope for the best, but I'm looking to God alone. Vain is the help of man." And that particular passage became a common sermon text, especially late in the war. But there were signs of hope. Beginning in 1862, you have revivals in both Union and Confederate armies, especially in the Confederates beginning in the summer of 1862. Suddenly, denominational differences didn't matter that much. Baptists could be sprinkled, Methodists could be immersed. That's not an example I just picked out of the air. That becomes an issue during the Civil War. How do you baptize a converted soldier properly? Well, you have to ignore some of these denominational differences during the war. Now, some of these, of course, don't entirely disappear. The Lutheran chaplain John H. Stuckenberg wrote in his diary at one point, "I'm surrounded by Methodists who are very clever but lack cultivation." What a terrible thing to say about Methodists. Anyway, now, at this point, everybody in this room ought to have a question. And I'll tell you what question you ought to have. Very helpful here. To what extent did the soldiers themselves interpret the war in terms of providential history? There were widespread reports of indifference to religion in the army, both before the revivals and after. Some soldiers simply commented, "There's no Sabbath in the army." Or they commented how difficult it was to be a believer in the army. They talked about the prevalence of drinking and gambling and swearing and all kinds of other sins. There was a lot of criticism of chaplains. In fact, both sides, I don't think, valued chaplains very much, and I have a very good piece of evidence for this. Both the Union and Confederate Congress reduced the chaplain's pay during the war. But, of course, we do have the revivals in the camps, north and south. And presumably these converted soldiers were more effective soldiers, even though ministers and many of the men themselves readily avowed that individual salvation was their first priority. And some soldiers could themselves sound like ministers in discussing the hand of God in battle, and also emphasizing religion as a source of comfort. In fact, James McPherson and others who've studied common soldiers have emphasized the fact that some of the religious soldiers were among the most dedicated soldiers, and I think there's some truth to that. How pervasive these religious sentiments were is another question, and talk about a difficult one to answer statistically. That is a very difficult one to answer statistically. In fact, it's an impossible one to answer statistically. Soldiers and civilians continue to talk of heavenly reunion. Prayers, however, increasingly focused on spiritual rather than national deliverance, and I think this is especially true in the South. The war would end but that end would only come in the Lord's good time. Perhaps the nation had not yet been punished enough for its sins. And of course, ministers on both sides warned against the sin of murmuring against civil authorities, military commanders, and against God. But certainly throughout the war, plenty of murmuring took place. Some Confederates came to argue that defeat with God was not so bad after all. And for the Federals, as the war neared its end, it seemed that the Lord had finally smiled in their cause. In fact, the day after Federal troops entered Richmond, news arrived in Washington. The Capitol was brightly illuminated. They had a gaslighted transparency emblazoned with the scriptural message, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." But in 1865, the forces of the modern world and its relentlessly secular tendencies were already putting great strains on this providential worldview. And this brings us to the ultimate meditation on divine purpose, Lincoln's second inaugural. You're going to get 2 doses of the second inaugural. That will be good for you. I can assure you, I think it's the greatest speech ever delivered by an American president. If you disagree with that, you're simply wrong. I don't want to hear about it. As we learned this morning, throughout his political career, Lincoln kind of cut against the grain of his own time. He didn't drink. He didn't join a church. And I would also add, he didn't render harsh judgments against others, including against Southerners. Throughout the war, he refused to automatically equate the Union cause with God's larger purposes. And even as Confederate armies appeared to be collapsing in the spring of 1865, Lincoln refused to yield to any temptation of triumphalism. And in that magnificent second inaugural, he somehow rose above the pious cliches so popular in both the North and the South. He noted how both sides had not expected the war to last so long or be so bloody, but it had. He said each looked for an easier triumph. And perhaps what's most amazing about the inaugural is as Union armies are about to triumph and Lincoln knows they're going to triumph, Lincoln doesn't brag on the achievements of his own administration. In fact, he barely alludes to the military course of the contest itself. He says each side, as I said, looked for an easier triumph. And then he says the prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. That's a pretty unsatisfactory answer, I think, to most people of the day. But then he makes this key point. The Almighty has his own purposes. Think about that for a moment. The Almighty has his own purposes. I don't want the Almighty to have his own purposes. I want the Almighty to have my purposes. And I think most human beings are probably of that ilk in one way or another, whether they want to admit it or not. Lincoln then went on to say if slavery was such an offense to God that the war had to continue, that both the North and the South had to endure a terrible war, then Lincoln could only conclude in the words of Psalm 19, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Now that's a very hard affirmation to make in the spring of 1865, because by that time, 620,000 or 750,000, Earl can sort that out in the question period, had lost their lives. Could their friends and families at that point simply say, "Thy will be done"? The Union victory, the Confederate defeat, left many hard questions about providence and the role of God in human history unanswered. As Lincoln readily acknowledges, the second inaugural is full of questions. It's not full of answers. It's not full of answers at all. And the whole idea of unanswered questions, which we're not used to, we're used to politicians giving answers to questions, whether they had those answers or not. We're used to them being much more confident than Lincoln sounds in the second inaugural. This whole idea of unanswered questions might deal a body blow to providential interpretations of history. And I think never again would an American war be interpreted in such openly religious terms. I'm not saying that religious interpretations of war disappear, by no means. But I don't think they will ever be as pervasive again as they were during the American Civil War. In fact, less than 2 months after offering his meditation on the meaning of the war and Providence in the war, Lincoln himself would fall victim to an assassin's bullet. Was Lincoln's assassination a providential event? Well, many at the time thought so, but that will have to be the subject for another occasion. Thank you very much.